For 40 years, I taught juries that a father's love is the least reliable witness in any courtroom. Then, at 1 o'clock in the morning, my son called me from a jail cell and I believed him. And I understood at once that I would have to prove it to the one judge I had never in my life been able to fool myself. The phone woke me out of the thin, dry sleep of a widower. I have answered a great many 1 in the morning calls in my time, dead jurors, hung juries, a courthouse fire once, and my hand knew the weight of the receiver before my mind did. Then I heard the recorded voice of the county detention system, cold and automated, informing me that I had a collect call from an inmate, and would I accept the charges, and I sat up in the dark with my heart already ahead of me. Dad. Wynn's voice, and it was wrong in a way I had spent 4 decades learning to hear. Not the wrongness of guilt, the wrongness of a man who has just discovered that the floor is not where he left it. Dad, they arrested me. Embezzlement. And they're saying I was driving the night the Pruitt boy died. A hit and run. Dad, I didn't do it. I didn't do any of it. I have heard I didn't do it perhaps 10,000 times. From the guilty, mostly. It is the most common sentence in the criminal justice system and the least meaningful. And I had trained myself, over 40 years on the bench, to let it pass over me like weather. A liar rehearses the facts. He has them polished and ready, and he recites them at you in order, smooth as a catechism. My son did not recite. He stumbled. He got the sequence wrong and doubled back. He fell silent in the places where a rehearsed man keeps talking, and he talked in the places where a rehearsed man goes quiet. Truth stumbles, lies recite. I had built a career on that single distinction, and everything I knew about it was telling me, against every professional instinct I owned, that the frightened man on the other end of this line was telling me the truth. Wynn, I said, and I kept my voice level, the bench voice, because he needed it. Who signed the arrest warrant? There was a pause, and in that pause I already knew, the way you know a verdict a half-second before the foreman speaks it. Dorian, my son said. It was Dorian, Dad. Dorian Bramwell, the county district attorney, my son-in-law, my daughter's husband, the man who was, at that very moment, 6 weeks from a nomination that would make him the chief law enforcement officer of the entire state. Before I take you one step further into how I took that man's whole life apart, brick by lawful brick, do one thing for me. Tell me down in the comments where in the world you are watching from tonight, and subscribe to this channel, because you are going to want to see every ruling in this case, right down to the sentence. I did not drive to the jail. I want you to understand why, because the restraint of that first night is the whole hinge of what followed. Every legal door in that county opened through Dorian Bramwell's office. Every prosecutor answered to him. Every judge still on the active bench had been, at one time or another, across a courtroom from him. And I, Judge Magnus Hollis, retired, whose name for 40 years had been a byword for impartiality, was the accused's father. If I so much as walked into that building demanding my son's release, the story wrote itself, and Dorian would write it. Retired judge leans on the system to spring his own son. My good name, the one thing I had guarded more carefully than my own life, would become the first weapon used against me. So I did not go. I sat in the dark, and I did the hardest thing a father can do. I stopped being a father, and I became, one more time, a judge, and I opened the case of the people against my own son, and I appointed myself to hear it. Let me tell you who I am, so you understand the machine they thought they were dismantling. I sat on the criminal bench for 40 years. I have presided over murders and frauds and the whole gray middle country of human failure. And in all that time I held to one thing above every other. One thing I believe more than I believe in God: the burden of proof. The state must prove its case beyond a reasonable doubt, and a single reasonable doubt, honestly held, is enough to bring the whole edifice of a prosecution down in ruins. I have freed men I privately believed were guilty because the state had not carried that burden, and I would do it again, because the day we convict on less is the day none of us is safe. The burden of proof is the load-bearing wall of a free society. Everything else is decoration. My wife Isolde died 6 years ago. 44 years married. She was the only person who ever saw both men in me, the judge and the father, and knew which one a room needed. On the day I was sworn in, all those decades ago, she had a gavel made for me, walnut and brass, with her own inscription cut into the handle, "Way True." It sat on my bench for 40 years, and on my study desk for 6 after. Remember it. It is going to matter a great deal. I have 2 children. Wynne is 38, an engineer, gentle to the point of exasperation, the boy who cried at animal documentaries and grew into the man who quietly managed the family trust because no one else could be bothered to be honest about money. And Cordelia is 41, sharp and bright and hungry in a way that frightened me even when she was small. Cordelia, who married Dorian Bramwell, and who had spent the last several years being slowly reshaped, in front of my eyes, into the kind of woman who could stand at a podium beside a man like that and smile. A liar rehearses the facts but forgets the silences. I had built my life on hearing what people do not say, and in the weeks before that phone call, I had heard, in my daughter's careful cheerfulness and my son-in-law's expansive warmth, a great and growing silence, and I had told myself, the way fathers do, that it was nothing. That was the error I would spend the rest of this story correcting. I did not sleep again that night. I sat at Isolde's desk with her gavel in my 2 hands, turning it over, reading Way True in the lamplight, and I made myself lay out the case against my son, the way I would have made a prosecutor lay it out in my courtroom. Embezzlement from the family trust, the trust Wynne himself administered, which meant the paper trail would already point at him by design, and a hit and run. The death of a young man named Pruitt, a tragedy with a grieving family and a hungry public, the perfect crime to hang on a Hollis in an election season. 2 charges, one financial and one bloody, chosen with a craftsman's care. One would strip Wynne of his place in the family and his standing to inherit. The other would put him in a cell and make my son-in-law a hero for putting him there. You do not board up a tunnel you have found in your own house. You map it. You learn where it goes, and who dug it, before you ever let them know you have found it. Isolde used to say it plainer, watching me pace some case into the small hours. Don't rule before the evidence is in, Magnus. Not even against a man you hate. Especially not then. I hated no one yet, that first night. I only knew that my son had stumbled, where a guilty man recites, and that the man who had jailed him was married to my daughter. I could not go to the police. Dorian was the police. I could not go to the courts. Dorian was the courts. I had no badge, no warrant, no standing but the standing of a grieving old man whose son was accused, which in the arithmetic of an election year counted for less than nothing. But I had 40 years of knowing exactly how a case is built, which meant I knew exactly where they are broken. At 8 the next morning, before I had decided anything, the doorbell rang, and it was Cordelia. She came into my kitchen in her good coat with her eyes already wet, and she took my hands, and she asked me gently, lovingly, the way you speak to a man whose mind you have decided is going to be strong, to accept what the evidence showed, to not make this harder than it had to be, for the family, for her, for Dorian's campaign. Please, Dad, my daughter said, holding my hands in my dead wife's kitchen. Wynne did this. I know it's terrible, but you have to let it happen, for all of us. And I looked into my daughter's face, and I saw that she believed it, or had been made to believe it. And I understood that the case was worse and deeper than a jail cell, because they had not only framed my son, they had recruited my daughter to help bury him, and she did not even know she was holding the shovel. Dorian Bramwell's campaign headquarters occupied a converted storefront on the town square, and I walked into it 2 days later, past a wall of blue and white signs that said, in letters a foot high, tough on crime, Bramwell for Attorney General. There is a particular obscenity in seeing those words hung by a man who has just manufactured a crime, and I let none of it reach my face. 40 years of receiving verdicts I disagreed with had taught me to carry a face like a sealed envelope. Dorian came out from behind a bank of volunteers with both arms open, warm, expansive, already campaigning, even here, even at me. He was handsome in the practiced way of men who have decided their face is an asset, silver coming in at the temples, exactly where a media consultant would want it. "Magnus," he said, gripping my hand in both of his, "I am so glad you came. I know how hard this is." And then I saw it, on the desk behind him, positioned in the sight line of anyone he brought back to that office. Isolde's gavel, walnut and brass, weight true cut into the handle, my dead wife's gift, on my son-in-law's campaign desk, turned into set dressing, a borrowed prop of judicial gravity, a stolen piece of a good name's authority, arranged just so beneath a tough-on-crime sign to make the whole rotten enterprise smell of the law. I looked at it, and I did not let my face move, but I made myself a small, cold, formal promise in front of that desk. The same kind of promise I had made in an empty funeral home once before. I am taking that back, in front of everyone, and I am taking it back myself. "Cordelia thought it belonged out where people could see it," Dorian said, following my eyes, smiling. "A little piece of the family legacy. You don't mind?" "Of course not," I said. He walked me through it in his glass-walled back office, and I let him, because a man explaining his own frame-up to a mark he believes is broken will tell you things no subpoena ever could. He laid it out like a closing argument for my benefit, he said. So I would understand. So I would not torture myself with false hope. "There was security footage," he said, placing Wynn's car at the scene of the Pruitt boy's death at the time of the accident. There were trust records showing $400,000 siphoned over 18 months, every transfer authorized under Wynn's administrator credentials. There was a witness. "It was," he said, with genuine seeming sorrow, "an airtight case, and the kindest thing I could do for everyone was to stand back and let the process work, and to lend it, by standing back, the dignity of my silence. Your name still means something in this county, Magnus," he said. "The most powerful thing you can do for this family is nothing. Let people see Judge Hollis trust the system, even when it costs him his own son." I understood then, precisely, the shape of the cage. They had not simply framed Wynn. They had weaponized me. 40 years I had spent making my name a synonym for impartiality, and now that name was a leash. If I fought, I was the corrupt patriarch, bending the law for his boy. And every word I said in Wynn's defense became proof of the family rot Dorian was running against. If I stayed silent, my silence was an endorsement. Even Judge Hollis believes it, that would help convict my son and elect the man who framed him. He had built it so that my integrity itself was the trap. The more honest my reputation, the tighter it closed. "I hear you," I said, and let my shoulders round, and let an old man's weariness settle into my voice. "You're right. I can't be seen interfering. It would only hurt Cordelia. And when I let it catch, if the evidence is what you say it is." The relief that crossed Dorian Bramwell's face was the relief of a man watching a heavy thing settle safely into place. And in the black glass of his office door, as he turned to walk me out, I watched him exchange a look with a lean, tired-looking man who had been waiting in the corridor with a folder under his arm. Ferris Lyle, I would soon learn, the forensic analyst who had produced the footage, and I watched the two of them share it. Not cruelty, something worse. Satisfaction. The easy professional glance of two men watching a difficult witness agree, at last, to stay off the stand. And I heard Dorian murmur to him, "Friday. The press conference is confirmed for Friday." And it landed in my ear precisely like a gavel coming down to close a case that had never been tried. He walked me to the door with his hand on my shoulder. I looked one last time at Isolde's gavel on his desk, and I said nothing, and I stepped out into the square under the wall of signs bearing his name. That night I did not sleep. I sat in my study with the lamp off and the town glowing cold beyond the window, and I held in my hands the spare gavel I kept in the desk drawer, a plain one, from my earliest years on the bench, its brass worn dull, and I let the grief and the fury rise all the way up, and then, deliberately, I set them down. Panic is inadmissible. I had told that to frightened young prosecutors for decades. It was time I took my own instruction. You cannot weigh a case with a shaking hand on the scale. Isolde again. Always Isolde way true. And I sat in the dark until the frightened father went below, and the other man came up and took the bench. The man who had freed the guilty when the state fell short and convicted the sympathetic when the proof held, because the law does not care whom you love. The judge and me took the bench, and the judge looked at the case entire, with the cold clarity of 40 years, and saw it whole. They had built something almost perfect. Footage, financial records, a witness, my son's own administrator credentials on every fraudulent transfer, so the paper pointed at him by design. My daughter recruited as a character witness for the prosecution without her ever knowing it. And my own reputation stretched over the whole apparatus like clean skin over a wound, so that any cut I made would open me first. If I stood up in the open and cried frame up, I was the biased father, and every objection I raised was one more count in the case against the Hollis name. You do not attack a case like that at its strongest point. You do not argue the footage on the courthouse steps. You find the one reasonable doubt, the single thread that, honestly pulled, unravels the whole weave, and you save it, and you produce it at the one moment when the whole world is watching, and the prosecutor can no longer control the room. They had already convicted my son in the court of public opinion. Dorian had booked a press conference to hold the sentencing. Very well. I would try their case. In the one court they had all forgotten I still knew how to run, and I would seat, as my jury, the entire watching state. The judge took the bench, and court, at long last, was in session. The performance began the next morning, and it was the hardest thing I have ever done, because it required me to lend my name to the lie that was killing my son publicly, deliberately, in front of the very cameras that were helping to hang him. I called a reporter I trusted, gave a short and dignified statement, and let it run. Retired Judge Magnus Hollis asked about the charges against his son, said only that he had complete faith in the justice system he served for 40 years, and that no man, whatever his name, stands above the law. It ran on the evening news beneath a photograph of Wynne in handcuffs. I watched it in my dark study, and I felt each word go into my son like a needle, because I knew he would see it, and I knew for a day or two he would not understand. But I understood what it bought. Dorian Bramwell watched that broadcast and saw the last threat to his campaign lie down and expose its throat. Even Judge Hollis believes it. The old man had folded. The most dangerous witness in the county had just endorsed the prosecution on the evening news, and there was no longer any reason to watch him. A man they had decided is broken is a man they stop guarding, and an unguarded prosecutor is a talkative one. Before I let the week carry me toward Friday, I did the most dangerous small thing of the whole affair. I asked to see the evidence. I went back to Dorian, humble now, a father who wanted only to make his peace with the truth, and I asked if I might view the security footage, not to challenge it, I said, but so that I could look at it and finally accept what my son had done, and stop torturing myself and my daughter with doubt. Dorian, who found this touching, men like Dorian always find a broken man's grief touching, right up until it becomes the blade, had Ferris Lyle play it for me in a conference room. And I watched it not as a grieving father, but as a man who has spent 40 years looking at evidence for a living. The footage was good. Wynne's car, his plate, the dark street, the terrible moment. A layperson would have wept and believed. But I have thrown out more fabricated evidence than most jurors ever see, and I know that a lie, however careful, leaves a seam. I watched it 3 times, and on the third I stopped looking at the car and started looking at the light. The timestamp in the corner read 9:47 inches the evening, in late October, and the shadows were wrong. There was a shadow thrown by the street lamp, yes, but there was also a soft, secondary shadow cast across the pavement from the west, long and low, the unmistakable rake of late afternoon sun. At 9:47 at night, in late October, in this county, the sun has been down for hours. There was no sun on that street, and yet the light in that footage fell as though the sun sat low in the western sky, because the underlying image, I understood, had been captured at a different hour and doctored to bear a nighttime stamp. A witness was lying to me, not a person. The light itself was lying, casting a shadow that the clock in the corner said could not exist. I said nothing. I let one real tear fall, which took no acting. And I told Ferris Lyle that I understood now, and that it helped to have seen it, and I thanked him. And I walked out carrying, for the first time, not a suspicion but a fact, with physics behind it. A shadow that could be measured against an almanac and a sun-angle table and shown, on a screen, to be impossible. If a machine had made that footage, the sky in it had a false alibi, and a false sky can be proven false to anyone who has ever watched an afternoon end. But I could not prove it alone, and I could not try it alone. So I began, quietly, to seat a jury of my own. The first call I made was to Delia Corwin. 9 years ago, Delia Corwin had been a homicide detective with an unbroken record and a superior who wanted her gone, and that superior had built a misconduct case against her out of nothing planted paper, a coached complaint, the machinery of a frame not so different from the one now closing on my son. The case landed in my courtroom, and I did the thing a judge is meant to do and so rarely does. I looked past the polished file to the seam in it, and I found the coaching, and I threw the whole thing out from the bench and said so, on the record, in language that ended the career of the man who had built it. Delia Corwin kept her badge and her name. She retired 2 years ago, and she had spent the decade since insisting she owed me the rest of her life, and I had spent it waving her off. When I told her what had been done to win, there was a silence on the line, and then Delia Corwin said, in the flat voice I remembered from the witness stand, a doctored timestamp and a prosecutor running for AG. Judge, do you understand what you've walked into? That's not one dirty case. That's a man who's decided the law is a ladder. Tell me everything, and don't touch the footage again. The second call was to Nona Reyes, an investigative reporter with a reputation for being unbuyable and unhurried, who had once covered my courtroom and never once quoted me wrong. She listened to all of it and said only, "If that footage is doctored, Judge, then this isn't a family tragedy. It's a district attorney fabricating evidence to win an election, and that is the biggest story in this state. Give me something I can prove, and I will put it in front of everyone. But it has to be airtight. He'll sue, and he'll have the machinery to do it," which was, more or less, the standard I had held prosecutors to for 40 years. And it steadied me to hear it come back in the mouth of someone who did not lose. And the third ally I did not recruit. She recruited herself. Her name was Serafina, and for 11 years she had been my courtroom clerk, the quiet, exacting woman who had kept my docket and caught my errors, and never once let a filing go out with a wrong date. When I retired, she had gone to work, as clerks do, for the county, which meant she now worked in the office of Dorian Bramwell. I did not know, until she asked to meet me in the back pew of an empty church, that she had watched my televised surrender and had not believed a syllable of it. "You don't have faith in this prosecution," she said, low, her hands folded tight. "I clerked for you for 11 years. I know what your face does when the evidence is real, and I saw your face on that broadcast, and it was lying." She looked at the altar rather than at me. "I've been transcribing things in that office that I've tried very hard not to understand. I told myself it wasn't my place. My mother used to say that it's not your place right up until it was too late to say anything else." Her voice thinned. "Mr. Bramwell dictates his case notes. Out loud. He thinks the recordings are private. I do the transcriptions. Judge, I have access to everything he says when he thinks no one is listening. Tell me what you need." I looked at this careful, decent woman who had decided, at real cost to herself, to stop being a fixture in another man's crime, and I understood that court was very nearly ready to convene. I had a detective who knew how frames are built, a reporter who could not be bought, and a clerk with the keys to the prosecutor's own private voice. Over the days that followed, I let Dorian tighten every knot himself. I let it be known, softly, through the family, that I had made my peace, that I would attend Friday's press conference, that I would stand with the family, that Judge Hollis would be seen accepting the verdict with grace. Dorian ate it whole. He wanted the picture badly, the incorruptible old judge standing behind him as he announced the conviction of his own brother-in-law, the ultimate proof that Bramwell put justice above blood. He would put me in the shot on purpose. Through Serafina, I learned the rest of the timetable, that the press conference was not merely a statement but a launch, that the Attorney General nomination was to be sealed on its momentum, that Dorian meant to stand in front of the cameras and turn my son's ruin into the first day of his campaign for the whole state. And every evening, court reconvened in secret. Delia began pulling the thread of the footage and the men who made it. Nona began, quietly, building a story she could defend against any lawyer alive. Serafina began transcribing and saving the things Dorian Bramwell said when he believed no one was listening. And I began to go through the one asset none of them yet knew I possessed, but that is a matter for the next tide, and I will come to it. Dorian believed the case was closed, and the old judge was seated safely in the gallery. He believed he had jailed his brother-in-law, silenced his father-in-law, and booked a room full of cameras to crown himself. He had spent his whole career learning how a case is won, and he had forgotten the first thing I learned about how one is lost. The most dangerous moment in any prosecution is not the crisis. It is the moment just after, when the confession is signed and the room relaxes and the prosecutor, certain, begins to celebrate and never once thinks to re-examine the one clean-looking piece of evidence he has already decided is unbreakable. He had booked a press conference to bury my son. He had just reserved the room in which I would try him. He had handed me a live camera, a statewide audience, and a false sky. Court, God help him, was about to be in session. TM Bondutra, BNG Kerm, Beat 1113. The evidence came to me in 3 tides over the days before the press conference, each higher and colder than the last, and by the time the third had gone back out, I understood that the case against my son was only the visible half of a thing that ran much deeper and much older than I had let myself believe. The first tide was Dorian's own voice. Serafina came to me in the empty church again and set a small recorder on the pew between us with the care of a clerk entering an exhibit into evidence. He dictated case notes yesterday, she said. He forgot I hadn't left. Judge, listen to the end of it. She pressed play. There was Dorian Bramwell's voice, unhurried, confident, the voice of a man narrating his own certainty into a machine he believed was his alone, reviewing the Hollis file. And then, near the end, a note to Ferris Lyle that the transcription would have flattened into nothing but that the raw audio caught whole. Ferris, the shadows still reading wrong on the second pass. Push the timestamp back another 40 minutes, so the light sits right, then re-render. Nobody watches a security tape for the Sun. Nobody watches a security tape for the Sun. He was right, of course. Nobody does. Nobody but a man who has spent 40 years being lied to by careful people and has learned that the truth hides in the details the liar thinks are beneath notice. Dorian Bramwell had just, in his own recorded voice, instructed his analyst to falsify the timestamp on the footage that would send my son to prison, and had done it in the tone of a man ordering lunch. I listened to it twice and set it down. Grief is a mistrial. I had a record to keep clean. The second tide told the truth, as plainly as the first had told the lie. It was a voicemail one Wynne had left, on the actual night the Pruitt boy died, at 9:44 the evening, to a colleague about a project deadline, its automatic timestamp, and the cell tower that carried it, placing my son 11 miles from that dark street, at the very minute the doctored footage claimed he was on it. He had left it and forgotten it, as people do. It had sat in a voicemail box for weeks, an ordinary, boring, unbreakable alibi, while my son sat in a cell for a crime the phone company could prove he was miles away from. The truth, it turned out, had been sitting in plain sight the whole time, because the truth usually is. It is the lie that has to be built. The third piece I had to go and take myself, and it very nearly ended the trial before it began. I needed the original footage, the undoctored source file, before Ferris Lyle's second pass, the version that would show either a true nighttime scene without my son, or a daylight image later dressed as night. Delia was certain a copy of the raw file would be logged in the county evidence management system, in the digital property room at the courthouse, and I still had a way in that Dorian had never thought to close. A retired judge, in this county, retains read-access credentials to the case file and evidence tracking system, a courtesy extended so that former jurists can consult their own old rulings. Nobody had ever revoked mine, because nobody had imagined a retired judge would use them to investigate a sitting district attorney. The night before the press conference, while the courthouse slept, I let myself into the records annex with credentials 40 years in the earning, and I sat at a terminal in the dark and pulled the Pruitt evidence log, and there it was, an original upload, and a second, enhanced file replacing it 2 days later. I copied the original onto the drive Delia had given me and watched the progress bar crawl across the screen in the green dark. And that is when I heard the annex door open, and Dorian Bramwell's voice, low, on the phone, coming down the corridor toward the records room. He had come back for something, a file, a folder, I never learned what. I did not panic. Panic is inadmissible. I moved the way I had moved through 40 years of courthouses after hours, quiet as a docket, and I stepped into the deep shadow between two tall shelving units of archived caseboxes, and I made my breathing go slow and even, the way I had sat motionless on the bench through hours of testimony, without so much as shifting my weight. He came in. He stood not 8 feet away. I could hear him breathing, hear him pull a box, and I found the way you reach for the familiar when there is nothing else that I had 2 fingers pressed to the pulse in my own wrist, out of 40 years of steadying myself before a hard ruling, and I was counting it. 64. 64. Steady. A clear field even now. He was close enough that I could have reached out and touched the sleeve of the man who had jailed my son and hung my dead wife's gavel over a campaign sign. And I stood in the dark and counted my own heart and did not move. He paused. He turned toward the row where I stood, toward the terminal I had left running. Its screen turned to the wall so that only a thin blade of light escaped along the floor. He frowned. He took 1 step toward it, and his phone buzzed in his hand. I saw the light of it flare, and he glanced down and swore softly, and turned and walked out of the annex to take the call, and the door sighed, shut behind him, and I stood in the dark a full minute more, counting a pulse that had never, in all of it, climbed past 70. The copy finished. I left the way I had come, through a door that 40 years of honest service had left open to me, with the true and undoctored night riding home against my chest. Delia was waiting in the car with the engine running, and the third tide broke over both of us there, and it turned the whole case. I ran the file, and I ran Dorian. She said before I had the door shut, "Sit down for this, Judge, because it's worse than a doctored tape in 3 directions." She turned her screen toward me. The first thing, the raw file was daylight. The original image had been captured at 4:50 inches the afternoon, a different day entirely, an empty street, no accident. No body, and Ferris Lyle had painted night over the top of it and stamped it 9:47. And the low western sun he could not fully scrub was the shadow that had betrayed the whole thing. My son had not been at the scene, because at the timestamp on that footage did not exist. That was the first direction. The second was in Dorian's history. Delia had gone back through his years as a young prosecutor, and she had found a case, a man named Alder, convicted of a killing 11 years ago on Dorian Bramwell's evidence, sent away for life. And buried in the file, in a disclosure log Dorian had signed, was the ghost of a thing that should never have been there. Exculpatory evidence. A second witness statement that pointed elsewhere, logged into the state's possession, and then never turned over to the defense. Alder had died in prison 4 years into his sentence, still filing appeals. This was not the first time Dorian Bramwell had built a man a cell out of the evidence he chose to show and the evidence he chose to bury. It was simply the first time the man in the cell was mine. And the third direction. Delia turned in the seat and looked at me the way, I imagine, she had once looked at suspects who thought they had covered every angle. "Cordelia," she said quietly, "I pulled the campaign's internal structure, the way I'd pull any conspiracy. Judge, your daughter isn't running this. She's collateral in it. Dorian's already restructured the campaign finances and the family trust arrangements so that after the election, she has no independent standing in either. He needed her to sell the story, grieving sister, loyal wife, the human face of a man who'd jail his own brother-in-law for justice. But the paper says that once she's served that purpose, she's as disposable to him as Wynne was. He didn't just frame your son and use your name. He set your daughter up to be discarded the moment she stops being useful. He's planning to hollow out your whole family, one child at a time, and keep only the parts that photograph well. I sat in the dark car and let the whole architecture of it settle, cold and complete. My son-in-law had doctored a sunset to jail my son, to launch a campaign, to become the chief law officer of the state, and he had done it before, to a man named Alder who had died for it, and he was preparing to throw away my daughter, the way he had thrown away my son, the way he had thrown away Alder, keeping nothing of the Hollis family but its useful reflection. I had a false sky I could prove with an almanac, a voicemail that placed my son 11 miles away, a recording of Dorian ordering the lie in his own voice, a dead man named Alder, and one asset none of them yet knew about, which I will come to. And I had now less than 48 hours, because Serafina's last message that night told me the thing I feared. Sensing his moment, Dorian had moved the press conference up. 2 days sooner, he would announce the case and seal his nomination the day after tomorrow, standing in front of every camera in the state, with my son in a cell and my dead wife's gavel over his shoulder. It would have to be enough. I had overturned convictions on a single honest doubt, and I had a great deal more than one. Court would convene on schedule, his schedule, in front of his cameras. The morning before the press conference, they let me visit Wynne, and I went, because a judge does not squander a rising docket, and I had one thing left to say to my son, while the men who caged him still believed I had accepted the verdict. They brought him to a visiting room with a camera in the corner. The jail records every visit, and Dorian would review this one. I was certain of it, so I performed for the lens the thing Dorian needed to see. A broken father, come to make his peace. I sat across the scarred table from my son, and Wynne looked at me with the particular betrayal of a man who had watched his own father tell the evening news he had faith in the system that was destroying him, and it took everything I had not to break my own performance at the sight of it. I let my shoulders round. I let my voice go tired and defeated for the camera. I told him, in words the lens could read, that I understood he had made mistakes, that the family would get through this, that he should cooperate with the process. I watched the last light of trust go out of my son's face, and I let it, because I had to. And then I leaned forward, as though to take his hand one last time, and I brought my mouth close to his ear, below the camera's reach, and I said, in the low and level bench voice he had not heard from me since he was a boy, the voice I had kept locked below the whole performance, "Hold the line, son. The verdict isn't in yet." I sat back before the camera could read the change in him, but I saw it land. I saw the confusion. And then, underneath it, the first ember of something I had been afraid was already dead. A man deciding, on his father's word alone, to keep breathing one more day. I carried that ember out of the jail with me, and it was the warmest thing I had held in weeks. That afternoon I did the hardest small thing of the whole affair. I went to see Cordelia. I found my daughter at her kitchen table, surrounded by the machinery of her husband's assent talking points, seating charts, a printed program for the press conference with her own name on it. And I did not tell her what I knew, because I could not yet, because she was still, in some part of her, defending the man who was preparing to discard her. But I looked at her, and I saw underneath the loyal wife brightness the same great silence I had heard in her voice for months, and I said only, "Cordelia, whatever happens Friday, I need you to remember that you have always been able to tell the truth in this family, no matter what it costs. That door is never closed to you." She looked at me strangely, and told me I was frightening her, and I kissed her forehead and left. I had not warned her, but I had, I hoped, propped open the one door I would need her to walk through when the room came apart. A father plants what he can, and prays for weather. It was the only kindness I could afford her, and I am not certain, even now, that it was enough. But it held. The trap itself, Nona Reyes and Delia Corwin and I built in a day, and its elegance was that we built almost none of it. We only arranged the room so the crime would have to declare itself in the open. The genius of what Dorian had done, the reason it had already killed a man named Alder and would have buried my son, was that every piece of it was hidden. A file doctored in a private lab. Evidence buried in a disclosure log. My son's credentials on transfers designed to point at him. My own reputation laid over the whole apparatus like clean skin over a wound. If I stood up and shouted "frame up," I was the biased father, and every word was another beat of the corruption he was running against. So we would not make Dorian defend a hidden crime. We would make him commit his fraud in the open, announce it, on the record, on live statewide television, in front of every camera and every voter he had gathered to crown him. Because Dorian's whole press conference depended on one thing: presenting the doctored footage and the fabricated case to the public as truth, to seal the conviction in the court of opinion, and launch his campaign on it. The moment he stood at that podium and told the state that this evidence was genuine, knowingly presenting fabricated evidence to the public and the press to obstruct justice and defraud an election, he would not be hiding a crime. He would be committing one, live, with the false sky playing on the wall behind him and the whole state as his witness. We did not have to stop the press conference. We had to let him hold it, confident and unwarned, and be ready, the instant he committed himself, to prove it false past any smooth man's power to explain. For that I gathered 3 instruments. The first was Dr. Adekunle, a forensic image analyst Nona trusted, a man who could take the doctored footage and lay it beside a solar position table and a shadow angle analysis and show, on a screen, in terms a child could follow, that the sun casting that shadow could not have been in the sky at the timestamp in the corner, the physics of the lie made undeniable. The second was Ferris Lyle. Delia found the leverage. Ferris had a professional license and a family and no appetite for prison, and when Delia laid before him the recording of Dorian ordering the render, and explained with great gentleness the difference between the sentence a fabricator receives and the sentence a cooperating witness receives, Ferris Lyle decided, as men do at the edge, to remember his conscience. He agreed to come forward and authenticate the doctoring with his own hands. The third was the institutional one. I took the Alder file, the buried exculpatory statement, the disclosure log with Dorian's own signature on it, to the State Judicial Conduct Commission and the bar's disciplinary board, and I timed the formal complaint to land the morning of the press conference. While Dorian stood at his podium committing a new crime, the record of his oldest one would be arriving on the desk of the body with the power to end him. And the last instrument I told no one about, not even Delia. Because there was a thing about me that Dorian Bramwell, in all his years marrying into my family, had never troubled to learn. For 40 years on the bench I had kept my own private record, not the official transcript, but my own contemporaneous notes and, in my later years, my own quiet recordings of the conversations that mattered, because a judge who will not keep an honest account of his own conduct has no business judging anyone else's. And that habit had extended to my family the way habits do. The Sunday dinners, the study conversations, the night, 2 years ago, when a young and confident Dorian Bramwell, a glass of my scotch in his hand, had told me, boasting, really, testing me about a case early in his career that he had managed, a man he'd been certain about, a conviction he'd made sure held. I had said nothing then. I had made a note and kept the recording and filed it away with the rest, and never once needed it. The man's name, in my note, was Alder. The press conference was held in the county courthouse's grand ceremonial room, 300 people and a bank of cameras beneath the state seal, and I took my place exactly where Dorian wanted me, in the front row, the incorruptible old judge, lending the whole obscene theater the dignity of my presence. Behind the podium, on a small table dressed for the cameras, sat Isolde's gavel. Way True turned to face the room. Along the walls stood people in ordinary clothes who were not ordinary. Delia, Dr. Adekunle with a laptop, Nona Reyes with her crew, and near the back a pair of quiet men from the Conduct Commission. The room was clear. The crime was about to walk in on its own feet. Dorian took the podium, and he was magnificent. I will grant him that to the grave. He spoke of a county made safe, of justice done without fear or favor, of a man willing to prosecute his own family for the rule of law. He gestured to me, the grieving father who trusted the system, and 300 people turned to look at Judge Hollis with something like reverence, and I let them. And then he said the words I had waited all week to hear. The evidence in this case, Dorian said, is conclusive. Let me show you. The screen behind him lit, and the doctored footage began to play my son's car, the dark street, the false timestamp burning in the corner, the impossible shadow raking across the pavement from a sun that was not there, broadcast live to the entire state as the truth by the district attorney who had ordered it made. He presented the fabrication to the world to seal his campaign. He committed the crime in the open, on the record, in front of the cameras and the commission and me, and he smiled while he did it. The clip ended. The applause began to rise, and I stood up out of the front row. Not the trembling half-rise of a broken father. I rose the way I had risen to deliver 10,000 rulings, spine straight, hands steady, and I felt the weariness fall off my face like a robe coming off. And I said, into the sudden silence, in the voice that had run that courthouse for 40 years, Mr. Bramwell, before you take questions, I let it carry to the back wall. I'd like to enter some evidence of my own. The room froze, and Dorian Bramwell, his smile cracking at the edges, reached for the podium microphone and said, smooth even now. Even here, Judge Hollis is understandably not himself. Grief is a terrible thing. Cordelia, and he turned, on live television, to my daughter seated in the second row, and he said, tell them your father isn't well. And Cordelia stood up, and she reached for the microphone he was holding out to her. Cordelia took the microphone from her husband's hand, and on live statewide television, in front of 300 people and every camera in the county, my daughter looked at the man she had married, and then out at the room, and she did not say the words he had fed her. My father, she said, and her voice shook and did not stop, is the most clear-headed man I have ever known, and he is trying to tell you the truth. And I have been too afraid to. I had propped that door open the day before, with a single sentence in her kitchen, not knowing whether she would ever walk through it. She walked through it now, on the largest stage of her husband's life, and I watched Dorian Bramwell's whole architecture take its first crack from the one load-bearing wall he had been most certain of. Play the analysis, I said to the back of the room, and Nona's people took the feed, and the great screen behind Dorian changed. It showed Dr. Adekunle's work, the doctored footage laid beside a solar position chart, the impossible shadow marked in red, the sun angle at 9:47 inches late October, plotted against the light that fell across that pavement, and Dr. Adekunle's calm voice came over the room's speakers, walking 300 people and a live state audience through it the way I had once walked juries through a diagram. The timestamp says, night, he said. The shadow says late afternoon. Both cannot be true. This image was captured at 4:50 inches the afternoon, on a day with no accident on that street, and was altered to bear a nighttime stamp. The sun in this footage, he said, has a false alibi. The sound that went through that room I had heard only a few times in 40 years on the bench, the sound of a large number of people understanding at once that the floor is not there. Dorian lunged for the microphone. This is a stunt, a grieving father, a manipulated daughter. Then explain the render order, I said, and I nodded, and Seraphina's recording played into the ceremonial room of the courthouse. Dorian Bramwell's own unhurried voice, filling the hall he had booked to crown himself. Push the timestamp back another 40 minutes, so the light sits right, then render. Nobody watches a security tape for the sun. Then the voicemail, my son's ordinary, boring, unbreakable voice. Time-stamped and tower located, 11 miles away, at the very minute the false footage placed him at the scene. And Ferris Lyle rose from his seat along the wall, and walked to the front, and authenticated the doctoring with his own hands, and named the man who had ordered it. Dorian stood at his podium with the state seal above him, and his campaign banner behind him, and the whole apparatus coming down, and the smooth thing in him finally broke. "You have nothing that holds," he spat at me, abandoning the microphone, his handsome face gone raw. "It's your word, your son, your daughter, a family closing ranks. I'm the district attorney. Who do you think they'll believe?" "I spent 40 years teaching juries whom to believe," I said, and the room was so silent the cameras could hear me without the microphone. "You should have remembered that. And there's one more exhibit." I let the silence hold, the way I had held 1,000 courtrooms on the edge of a ruling. 11 years ago, you convicted a man named Alder. You had a second witness statement that pointed away from him. You logged it into evidence, and you buried it, and you never turned it over. And Alder died in prison still swearing he was innocent because he was. I have the disclosure log with your signature. And I have you, in your own voice, at my own dinner table, 2 years ago, glass of my scotch in your hand, bragging to me about the conviction you made sure held. That is the second blade, the one I had kept sheathed under the robe the whole trial. Dorian Bramwell had used my good name as a leash. He had never once considered that the old man on the end of it had spent 40 years recording everything, and had been holding his oldest crime in a drawer since the night he was foolish enough to boast of it. "You used my name as a leash," I said. "You should not have handed me so much rope." The apparatus came apart faster than any of them could run from it. The 2 quiet men at the back of the room were from the Judicial Conduct Commission and the State Bar, and the formal complaint on the Alder case, the buried exculpatory evidence, the signed disclosure log had landed on their board that very morning, exactly as timed. The doctored footage was a crime committed live in front of them. The Alder file was a crime 11 years buried, and now exhumed. State investigators, whom Nona's producers had made quietly aware that a story of this size would break on their watch whether they were ready or not, were waiting before Dorian left the podium. He tried, cornered, to do what men at the tops of these structures do. He turned on Cordelia, on live television, and tried to name her the architect, the ambitious wife who had driven it all. But Cordelia had already chosen the truth, and she had the campaign's own restructured finance documents that Delia had pulled, the ones that proved Dorian had arranged to discard her the moment she stopped being useful. The wife he had set up to be his fallback scapegoat became, instead, the witness who buried him. He had built his cage to hold my whole family, and he had, at the very last, forgotten to leave himself out of it. They took Dorian Bramwell from the ceremonial room of the courthouse in which he had meant to be crowned. The nomination evaporated before he reached the door. The campaign finances were frozen within the week. The Alder case was reopened, and with it a review of every conviction Dorian Bramwell had ever touched, because a prosecutor who buries evidence once has taught the whole system to doubt him forever. Ferris Lyle was not charged. His cooperation and his conscience were entered into the record, and I saw to it, through Nona, that they were remembered. Cordelia was not charged. A woman who breaks a conspiracy open on live television from inside her own marriage is not a defendant, whatever the fear that kept her in it, and I would have testified to that in any courtroom in the land. And in the chaos of it, I walked to the small dressed table behind the abandoned podium, where Isolde's gavel sat facing the room, walnut and brass. Way true, and I picked it up, and I did not say a word to anyone. I had made myself that promise in front of that desk weeks before, and I keep my promises. I put it in my coat where it belonged, and I went to find my son. They released Wynne that evening. He walked out of the county jail into the cold with the ember I had left in him weeks ago somehow still burning, and he did not say anything, and neither did I. He just put his arms around me the way he had as a boy who cried at animal documentaries, and I held my son, who had called me from a cell and said I didn't do it, and been believed, and been proven right, and for a moment I let my own steady hands, at last, shake. Cordelia stood a little apart, uncertain whether she still had the right to be there. I put out my other arm, and she came, and I held both my children in the cold outside a jail, the way I had not held them together since their mother was alive, and none of us said anything at all, because there was nothing that needed saying that the last 2 weeks had not already made true. A full year has passed now, and the scales sit level again. Wynne was fully exonerated, his name cleared in the same press that had convicted him, and he administers the family trust again, more carefully than ever, though he no longer trusts money the way he used to, and I do not blame him. Some things a frame teaches you that you cannot unlearn. His oldest gavel sits on my study desk where it belongs, way true catching the lamp, and some evenings I find Wynne looking at it, and I think he understands now what it cost his mother to give it to me, and what it is for. Cordelia is rebuilding a life from the foundation up, alone, and it is slow and it is hard, and it is entirely hers. The fear that Dorian used to fold her into his crime did not vanish when he did. She is learning, in a way she never had the chance to before, to tell the truth even when it costs her everything, and I have watched her do it now more than once. We are not what we were before this. We are, in some ways I did not expect, more. A father and a daughter who have both stood in front of cameras and chosen the truth over the family's comfort, have a thing between them that easy years never build. There is a man named Alder who cannot be brought back, and I will carry that. But because of what came out in that ceremonial room, his name has been cleared, and his children have been told, at last and on the record, that their father was innocent and that the state failed him. It is not enough. Nothing is ever enough for a man who died in a cell for another man's ambition. But it is the truth, entered into the record. And after 40 years I have learned that the truth, entered into the record, is the only monument that lasts. I have started something with what is left of my time. The Isolde Hollis Project, my son named it, over my objection. It does one thing. It re-examines the convictions of poor men and forgotten men, men without a retired judge for a father, for the buried evidence and the doctored proof that put them away. Delia Corwin runs the investigations. Nona Reyes writes what we find. Serafina keeps the records, honestly, as she always did. We have cleared 2 men already. There will be more. Now let me speak to you directly, because this story was never only mine. If you have ever believed that the law is a machine that runs itself, hear the thing that nearly cost me my son and my daughter both. The law is not a machine. It is a set of hands. And hands can be honest or they can be bought. And the only protection any of us has against the second kind is the burden of proof, the old, unglamorous, load-bearing principle that the powerful must prove their case before they may destroy a life, and that a single honest doubt is enough to stop them. Men like Dorian Bramwell do not fear the law. They fear that principle because it is the one thing they cannot doctor. Guard it. It is not decoration. It is the wall that holds the roof up over all of us, the innocent and the accused alike. And the day we let a man tear it down to win an election is the day none of our children are safe. And if the powerful ever turn that machinery against someone you love, against your child, your name, your family, do not despair, and do not go quietly, and do not confuse their confidence for proof. Keep your own records. Find the one honest soul who will believe you. Pull the single thread that the liar thought no one would notice, the shadow in the wrong place, the silence in the wrong spot, the sun that could not have been there, and hold the line. The verdict is not in until you say it is. They can doctor a sunset. They cannot doctor an honest man's record, and they should never, ever hand the rope to a judge. If this story showed you that a quiet man is not a weak one, and that an old judge's patience is not surrender, then do the one thing I asked at the very start. Hit the like button, subscribe to this channel, and tell me down in the comments what city you are watching from tonight. I read every single one. I will see you when court is next in session. Way true, and hold the line.